Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, it's Mark Graban. Welcome to a bonus episode as we continue our summer hiatus on the podcast. Today, I'm bringing you, it's a new episode from my new podcast series I started almost a year ago called My Favorite Mistake. This is an episode with a person and a voice you will possibly recognize from past episodes of this Lean podcast. And he is David Meier. He is the co-author of 2 books with Jeffrey Liker. He's the co-author of the Toyota Way Field Book and Toyota Talent. After retiring from Toyota or leaving Toyota, he became a consultant and has done work with TPS and Lean around the world. But a couple years ago, he started a really nice distillery in Kentucky called Glenns Creek Distillery. So if you want to go back and hear old episodes with David in this podcast series, you can go to leancast.org or go all the way back in your podcast app here. He was my guest in episode 17, talking about Lean in China. Episode 31 and 35, talking about the book Toyota Talent. Episode 85, talking about some of the challenges that Toyota was facing at the time. And then we did episodes 304 and 309. 304 is, again, talking about the lessons he learned from Toyota. Episode 309, we get into his work distilling bourbon. How is he integrating lean concepts into that environment that does not build cars? So in today's episode, he shares a favorite mistake story from his time at Toyota. David talks about kind of creating a culture where it's safe to bring up mistakes and to focus on problem solving, to be hard on the process, not on the people. So he shares those Toyota stories and thoughts, and then he talks about some mistakes made in the process of distilling. So if you enjoy this episode, please do subscribe to My Favorite Mistake. Not all of the guests are lean folks, but some of them are, and I get to interview people from all kinds of other interesting industries and lines of work. So you can learn more at myfavoritemistakepodcast.com or whatever app you're listening to this. Do a search for My Favorite Mistake. You'll find it. I hope you'll listen. I hope you will enjoy it. Now, thanks. Here is the My Favorite Mistake episode with David. Episode 94, David Meier, founder of Glenns Creek Distillery.
Something that's hard for people to do sometimes, to admit that they're human and that they can make mistakes.
I'm Mark Graban. This is My Favorite Mistake. In this podcast, you'll hear business leaders and other really interesting people talking about their favorite mistakes. Because we all make mistakes, but what matters is learning from our mistakes instead of repeating them over and over again. So this is the place for honest reflection and conversation, personal growth, and professional success. Visit our website at myfavoritemistakepodcast.com. For links, show notes, and more, go to markgraban.com/mistake94. Please follow, rate, and review. If you like the episode, please share it with somebody. Share it with your colleagues and connections on social media. Thanks. And we're joined today by David Meier. David's a friend of mine. We've known each other for, maybe 15 years or so when we crossed paths?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, so we've crossed paths in work circles, in what I would call my day job, maybe your previous job, or would you still call that type of work that we've done the day job, or is that behind you now?
No, I still do a bit of the consulting when things come along.
So let me give a little bit more formal introduction to David Meier. We crossed paths after he had a very interesting career at Toyota. He has then worked as a consultant doing similar types of work to what I do. And he's also co-author of 2 really excellent books. One is called the Toyota Way Field Book, and the other one is called Toyota Talent. And more recently, and this is of particular interest of mine, David has started, he's the founder of Glenns Creek Distillery in Kentucky, and I've had a chance to visit the distillery twice, and I enjoy his products very much, and I'm going to give congratulations and a shout out to you that David has gotten really nice acclaim in the Jim Murray 2021 Whiskey Bible. So, David, congratulations for that recognition.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I just actually saw that recently myself, so that was nice. And Mr. Murray visited the distillery a couple of years ago, so it's kind of a good experience.
Yeah, so we'll come back and talk a little bit more about the distillery and the whiskey, but I think we're going to talk first about your experiences at Toyota. And regular listeners will realize we're going to deviate from the standard a little bit here. Normally, we jump right into the favorite mistake question, but David's going to first tell us a little bit more about some of the background of what he learned working at Toyota.
Yeah, when I first saw your blog and really appreciated the idea of being able to talk about mistakes, because it's something that's hard for people to do sometimes, to admit that they're human and that they can make mistakes. And when I started at Toyota, I was 27, and I was put into a leadership role there, and I'd had some leadership experience in the past, but certainly not very much. And one of the things that I found frustrating and kind of made me angry was that when my people would make mistakes, the blame, it felt like came down on me. And Toyota operates a no fault, no blame culture, but we are brought up, you listen to any 2-year-old kid and they say, it's not my fault, he did it. And, we're brought up with this idea of, find fault and place blame. And there's a difference between that and being responsible. Toyota teaches that the leader's responsibility is to develop and create processes and systems that allow people to do their best work. And, but certainly it was hard for me in the beginning with that situation. And as time went on, I got to understand the difference between, responsibility for something and fault or blame about something. And certainly when you make a mistake, you have the responsibility for that mistake. And it's expected at Toyota then that you're also going to propose, some corrective action or something to help prevent that mistake from occurring again.
Yeah. So there's learning that takes place then. Yeah.
Right. And I used to, when one of my people would make a mistake, I'd go out to the process area and I'd look at the situation and honestly, I'd think sometimes, well, how stupid could they be that they don't understand the correct way to do this? And it took me a while, a couple of years actually, to be able to kind of clear my brain of any forethoughts about the situation and then look at it from a novice's point of view, if you will, and say, okay, if I didn't understand this system, and since I was the one who designed it, clearly I understood it. And if I didn't have that understanding, is it actually that clear to others? And, of course, the answer is no, not really. And so you have to understand that when people make mistakes, it's not intentional and it's called a mistake. Right. And so that really changed for me. And, at the distillery now, when we have a new hire or something, I just tell them, I said, look, you can't really make a mistake that hasn't been made here already. We've done this, we've screwed up that, we've done this kind of thing. And so you're not going to come up with something new. Now, every now and then they surprise me and come up with something that hasn't happened, but everybody goes through this kind of a similar learning process, and certain things happen. Hey, we don't want to let any distillate go on the floor, but sometimes it does, and that's sad.
So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit, David. Because you hear things like there's variations on these expressions: "Be hard on the process, not on the people," and this idea of not blaming the frontline workers. At what point is a frontline supervisor, a frontline leader, responsible versus also being part of the system?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was struggling with, initially, is the idea that you have responsibility for process improvement or developing people. It's one of those things where, I don't know. It takes a while because the way we're brought up. I mean, we're brought up with this mindset, and all of a sudden you're placed in this different situation. And when you're being sort of scolded in a way for what occurred, but not blamed. I mean, it's a strange thing to adapt to, really, and it's just clear that, okay, you have a responsibility. And your responsibility is to ensure these things and to do these things and to follow through on these things. And that's not a criticism per se. That's an expectation, right? And another thing, Toyota has the process, or out there we have error proofing or mistake proofing, whatever you want to call it. And I always tell people, I said, there's no such thing. I listened to your podcast about almost losing those podcast recordings, and you talked about backup and so on and so on, and at one point you kind of said it's virtually fail safe or something to that effect, and I would say no. Nothing is, and you can acknowledge that. You're going to get a solid state drive, and it's certainly more robust than a spinny drive. But there is no actual error proofing, right? In problem solving, Toyota uses the word countermeasure. You use that word, countermeasure, and if you understand that term, it has to be deployed continuously in order to be effective. And I always tell people, I said, look, for every system that you put in place, okay, if a human puts a system in place, another human can work around that system or bypass that system or shortcut that system, right? So the idea of error proofing isn't really to eliminate the error, it's to make it more difficult to make a mistake. It's not possible to totally eliminate mistake.
So you might use a term like error mitigation instead of proofing. That sounds very absolute. Maybe, there are simple cases where you can absolutely error proof something.
Well, I would beg to differ on that, because you can always bypass something, right? Yeah. If it's possible for a human to invent it, it's possible for a human to circumvent it. So, mitigation is probably a better term. And so, with that in mind, we do have to acknowledge that mistakes are sort of inevitable, but you can apply certain thinking to minimize them in some ways. In some cases, it's not possible to apply something, or certainly not easy to apply something.
Well, and you talk about, you use the word responsibility, a different ability word that comes to mind. I hear this way too often in healthcare. It's not exclusively a healthcare thing, but it's really common in healthcare. The word accountability gets thrown around and gets weaponized. Well, we're going to hold people accountable, which is a polite way of saying we're going to blame them and we're going to punish them. So, I mean, was part of the difference at Toyota that scolding, or what felt like blaming, was the punishment replaced with learning and improvement?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a very good point, and that's a point that I often make. I said they want to make accountability this way, right?
Right.
You need to be accountable. And I say, no, accountability goes this way, right? I need to be accountable. Can you help me be accountable? We're in this together. And if I agree that I'm going to live a certain way or behave a certain way, and you experience me not behaving that way, then you help me be accountable. Right? So it's I think I agree with you. Kind of weaponizing it between the words means, yes, we're going to And here, fill out this paper to agree that you understand this situation, so that if you fail to do this, then we can punish you and get what you deserve.
Yeah. And the word accountability, I mean, going back to the root words, and I mean, it means basically to give account, which is about explaining,
right?
Which is different than, I think, a notion of responsibility. And that root of accountability it wasn't meant to imply blame and punishment.
Right.
You can explain what happened. That's a healthy thing to figure out, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, so you mentioned the episode where I almost lost, where we talked about Jamie Parker interviewed me about the episodes I almost lost. That was episode 16,
right.
For people who want to go back and listen to that. But David, you mentioned the episode with Mr. Yoshino, Katie Anderson and Mr. Yoshino. That was episode 30. Let me double check that so I don't make
recent. I think it was one of your more recent ones.
It was recent. It was episode 30 for people who want to go back. Mr. Yoshino told a story about being very young, early in his career at Toyota, and he made a mistake. You could call it a slip up. He basically grabbed the wrong container of something in the paint area, and it caused a problem. And it sounds like that error was too easy to make. So what was your reaction to that story and some of that?
Well, that's exactly when I decided to reach out to you, because my mistake is very similar to that one, and I related to it quite well when he started talking about that. I said, "Oh, yeah, been there, done that." So I think I'll just launch into it for you. And the first thing is, this wasn't really my mistake. And one of the things I try to explain to people is that at Toyota, or just like your explanation of Swiss cheese, okay, a lot of things have to line up sometimes for the quote mistake to actually occur, right? And all those things, if all of them don't line up, then the mistake didn't happen, but you maybe had a near miss, as you sort of described. And this is really one of those cases. So this was about, I think, 4 to 5 years into my Toyota experience. So we weren't exactly newbies at that point. And in one morning, my team leader came up to me, and I could see just kind of white-faced, something wasn't right. And he says, the bumper core process is powder. And I'm just looking at him and thinking to myself, powder? This is supposed to be the energy absorber, they called it in the vehicles back then. It was a polyurethane, hard foam piece. I mean, not powder, right? And so I walked over there with him and take a look at the situation. And it's like, sometimes you experience something that is so far beyond your realm of experience that you just can't process it. I mean, there would be nothing like this. The typical defects that we experience, that you deal with kind of day in and day out. This was so far out of that realm that it just, totally blank. So at Toyota, you understand some things. And one of those things is you have about an hour's worth of work in process inventory between you and the next process, in that case, bumper paint. And bumper paint has about an hour's worth of inventory between them and the assembly line. So you got about 2 hours before everything stops. So that's number one. So you immediately call the managers and maintenance and the engineers and everybody to come down to the problem area. And again, in retrospect and looking back on it, I think sometimes you're experiencing something, again, that's so far beyond the realm of your possibilities that you just don't know what to do. But everybody puts their heads together and says, okay, let's take this action. We'll drain the chemical system and we'll refill the system and we'll start from scratch and we'll see how it goes. So, this process alone to drain the system, you're talking an hour or so. We've never done it before. It's never had to happen, so we don't really know. And then you got to fill it up, and then the chemicals have to blend, and so on and so on. So you're 2-3 hours into this thing before you can even have an effective chance at a countermeasure. And to make matters worse, once you pour these parts into the mold, it goes through a heating cycle that takes about 11 minutes. And I would say it's like when the astronauts go to the other side of the moon. You're waiting, right? You're sitting there waiting, hoping and praying that these parts are going to be okay after all this work. And the mold comes around, opens up, and powder again. I mean, just crumbly powder. So we're all scratching heads. And you have to understand one thing here, Mark. In addition to those of us who had been with Toyota 4 years, we had a lot of seasoned Toyota veterans from Japan working with us at that point in time. I mean, 20, 30-year guys, okay? And nobody had experienced anything like this. And it was, so the decision was made this time that maybe the automated system was messed up somehow and it wasn't putting in the right material and so on and so on. And so let's drain it all down and then we'll refill it manually, which again, had never actually been done. So we got to get the manual out and figure out how to actually make that happen. So, several more hours goes by, and this happened to me more than one occasion at Toyota where the process really was down for quite a long time. And, it's kind of, I'd say you look up and all of a sudden there's 25 people from all over the plant, every manager from every department comes because they all want to know, what are we going to do with our people? How long might this take? And everybody kind of comes together. And so I'd say you have 25 new friends that you didn't know about before. So anyway, go through this whole process of redoing it all manually and same thing, put it in the mold, goes around the oven, 11 minutes, you're waiting. And then mold opens up, powder.
Yeah. Yuck.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now we're, I don't know, 6 hours into this, 7 hours into this. And everybody understands when the line stops, it's everybody understands the significance of that.
Right.
And everybody's doing their best to try to get it resolved. So at that point, people are kind of wandering around and looking and trying to think, what else could it be? What else could it be? And, off to the side, my recollection is off to the side, I hear somebody saying, what do you do with methylene chloride? My ears perk up, right? And I'm like, what now? Now, I was familiar with methylene chloride because of my previous job. I worked as a safety coordinator and I had to deal with the chemicals and so forth. But we had no use for those in the plastics department, right? There's no methylene chloride was needed anywhere that we did. So I immediately went over to where he was. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, this drum here says methylene chloride on it. Mm-hmm. I said, oh my gosh, we're putting a solvent in where we were supposed to be putting a catalyst in.
Yeah.
Okay. So instead of solidifying the material, it was degrading the material.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So when you analyze that at the end, and we had to do an analysis and we had to do problem solving, and Mr. Cho, our president, basically asked one question: what did we learn today? And the thing about it is, Mark, the mistakes that led to the line stop, the downtime, weren't actually the big mistake. The big mistake, which took me about 10 years of reflection to understand, was what took us so long to figure out what caused the issue. Mm-hmm. See, it was 7 hours in, and we missed one of the most fundamental lessons when a problem occurs or when a mistake happens. One of the fundamental lessons which we had been taught over and over and over at Toyota. Right? Now, to analyze the mistake, what happened? Well, you could do a 5 whys and say, well, somebody put the wrong material in the system. Why? Because the wrong material was delivered. Why? Because it was in the wrong location. Who knows? It could have been a mistake on the shipping and bill of lading or where they stored it at oil stores. The drum was the same color, the same size, and the same manufacturer.
Yeah.
So we know things like expectation bias get in the way, right?
Mm-hmm.
It looks normal.
This sounds like some medication errors.
Yes. Yeah. Same kind of thing, right? It looks normal. It doesn't look out of place. And so we literally walked by it all day long and failed. And again, it took me a long time to really understand where we failed. And the thing about it is, Mark, in that case, all of us there failed in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I'm not talking 2 or 3 people. I'm talking 20 people, 25 people. Okay. Very experienced people who, should know better. And the failure was we didn't verify the standard. Nobody thought to say, hey, let's go and check all the chemicals that we're putting in the system, or, hey, let's switch them all out and put a fresh batch in. Right. The feeling we got latched into, and this happens a lot too, where you latch into one possibility, and it must be the blending system. It wasn't about what we put in the system. It was about the system itself.
I mean, that seems like that's a form of cognitive bias. I've heard others talk about the first solution that people come up with. We tend to lock in or gravitate too strongly toward that one. Even if we're trying to brainstorm multiple possibilities, I think our brain tends to stick with the first one, which, that's at our own risk, I guess.
Yeah, it is. It's extremely common. And, particularly, I think, in that scenario where we were faced with a situation that was so far beyond anything that we could imagine as a cause. And, with your everyday defects or everyday situations that you've kind of dealt with before, and you kind of go back to what in this case, it was too far out there. And I think, as I recall, there was a list drawn out about what could be going on and so forth. But the blending system was focused on, and we didn't go and look and see what all the materials were. Were they the correct materials? I mean, that's a fundamental thing. Step number 1 is confirm that what you're dealing with is what it's supposed to be.
But there might have been a bias or an assumption where people might have thought such a fundamental error like that wasn't going to happen. It must be something really complicated instead of being something really simple.
Well, yeah, that's a possibility as well. And again, looking visually, literally looking, that drum was the same color, the same size, the same manufacturer. From several feet away, it didn't look out of place. It didn't look abnormal. It didn't look like something was wrong. And but still, the idea when it finally occurred to me that we all fundamentally failed to do the most basic thing, which is confirm. And expectation bias or confirmation bias, you're absolutely right. Those are things that often get in our way when we're trying to resolve a situation, or we're trying to or avoid mistakes. A lot of mistakes in healthcare, it's common. Expectation bias says, oh, I'm working with Mark, and Mark's a really good guy, and I trust Mark, so I don't need to double check Mark on what Mark did because he's a good guy. And so it's a very common phenomenon, I think, in the realm of making mistakes.
Yeah. So you mentioned it took quite a long time for this to really kind of come together in your mind. What triggered that learning or that recognition of, like, for one, the memory of that, and then the recognition of the mistake within trying to figure out the mistake?
Well, what I call the bigger mistake, because if we had checked and confirmed things, we could have resolved it within the first effort and drained the system because clearly it had contamination in it, refill it with the correct things, and probably be back to normal much sooner, hours and hours sooner. I think, back then, certainly I was not as experienced as I am now, or became later when I finally understood it. We sat down and we did what people do with problem solving. Well, why did the wrong material end up in that place? And what mistake was that? And what can we do to make sure that mistake doesn't happen again? And I don't think anybody ever asked the question to say, but I learned this later, is to say, how can we resolve problems more quickly? How can we get to effective countermeasures faster so that we don't experience the length of downtime? We focused on how, the mistake, which was putting the wrong chemical in the wrong place.
Well, and many organizations would have gone down the path of who put the wrong chemical into the machine, and might go down that path of, well, we're going to write them up or punish them, or right. And that doesn't, that's not as effective of a path to learning and improvement, and ultimately success for the team or the plant or the company.
Right. We did not have a process in place that said to the operator, verify the chemical before you stick the hose in it. Right. And that was one of the corrective actions that took place. And I think, to make matters worse, that the individual who actually did it was a temporary. Mm-hmm. Okay. It was summertime, and we would hire children of workers from college or whatever to come and fill some jobs in the summer. But look, it was the Swiss cheese. It wasn't the final act of putting it in. Certainly, it was also the delivery of the wrong thing. It was also the pickup of the wrong thing, and who knows how far back the series of mistakes actually went.
Yeah. But then, like you were saying earlier, error mitigation, or it might be very imperfect, or people can work around a system, or, if it's dependent on someone double checking the chemical, they might forget, or they might be distracted, or there might be some other human factor that gets in the way.
Well, yeah. And just like in any good system, like in aerospace or whatever, the more critical it is, the more redundancies you want to have. And we had multiple redundancies, and they went back all the way to oil stores, which is where the chemicals were received in the plant and then delivered to us. And the person who set it there had to confirm it. The person who was to put it in the machine had to confirm it. And so, and I believe, if I recall, we actually got the supplier to change the color of the drum so that it, didn't match methylene chloride or whatever. So, I mean, all of those countermeasures were fine, but again, later I realized, wait a minute, why did we fail at this fundamental lesson that says, when something isn't working right, go back and verify the conditions or the parameters or whatever, verify the standard first thing. And if you find something that's out of standard, you put that back in standard and go from there. And it's kind of surprising, like I said, because there were so many people involved who all sort of fell into the same trap.
Well, and so I appreciate you sharing that story and the broader reflections from Toyota. I want to bring the conversation back to Glens Creek Distillery and the work that you've been doing there. And I'll put in the show notes. David and I have done interviews in my Lean podcast series where we take a real deep dive into what he's doing there, and I'll point to that. But one thing I was going to ask, the thing that comes to mind, I don't know if this was a mistake or a discovery, and maybe this is urban legend, but the idea that bourbon was transported down the Mississippi River and it was put into oak barrels for the purposes of transportation. And then it was discovered that the time spent in the oak barrel changed the whiskey, taking it from a clear distillate to something with more flavors and color. That could have been framed, whether that story is true or not exactly. What might have been a mistake in transportation, like, well, they didn't use an inert stainless steel container, if that even existed at the time. But
No,
that quote unquote mistake actually led to the creation of a lot of value through that learning and that discovery.
well, I'd go way back in human history, Mark, and say that mistakes or things, whatever you want to call it, led to a lot of new things. So my guess is that humans discovered that sprouted seeds fermented, and that's because this sprouting of the seed releases enzymes that then convert starch in the seeds into fermentable sugars. And to discover that, you probably had sacks of grain that got wet accidentally and then sprouted and started fermenting. And then you saw animals eating that fermented stuff and having a great time. And you put two and two together and say, hey, let's do this.
Yeah.
But I think the story you're referring to is more urban legend.
Okay. I thought,
there's a lot of legends like that in this industry. Who's the first distiller, who first did this and that. In fact, liquids were stored in oak containers well before the United States was the United States. And if you look at it, if you see any of these old shows or whatever, of course, you're going to see wooden barrels all over the place because that was the way everything was transported. Not only did they not have stainless steel, they didn't have plastic, they didn't have cardboard, and they didn't have any, and so you had two different kinds of barrels. You had dry goods barrels that didn't have to hold liquid, and you had liquid type barrels. And so anything liquid, wine, honey,
molasses,
whiskey would have been transported, in a barrel. I think the difference was barrels for wine, for example, are typically toasted but not charred, and so the charring process lends a lot to the bourbon. It gives it a more amberish color and certainly some smoky flavors, perhaps, and so on. So that legend, of course, can't be validated either. That Elijah Craig, was a tightwad and he had a pickle barrel or sardine barrel or something that liquid, and he wanted to reuse it. So in order to get rid of the flavor, he burned the inside of it and created good whiskey. But it's a tall tale. I think the French, as I understand it, were charring barrels and storing whiskey in barrels years before.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and then Scottish listeners may claim some right of first discovery to some of that, but
yeah. Well, I don't think they use charred barrels, but humans tens of thousands of years ago, the Vikings had discovered that white oak was pretty good for making boats because it kept liquid out, and I'm sure then people realized you could use it to keep liquid in as well.
Yeah. Maybe as a final question before we wrap up, can you think of an example in your distillery operations where you've got some sort of maybe not mistake proofing, but error mitigation strategy in place? You said you've made a lot of mistakes already, but what sort of prevention do you try to put in place?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, a lot of what we do is sort of manual in nature, and when you have manual things, it's a little bit more challenging to put in error proofing. So what I try to do in that case is build the step into the standard work. Okay. So for example, when you're going to fill the still, you've had to drain the still, and you certainly want to make sure that the valve is closed. Now we could automate that, right? I could put actuators in there and have all that automated, but that's expensive. And, it's an easy enough task, but it happens sometimes. But you learn to say, okay, step number one, close the valve. And then step number two, when you get ready to turn on the pump to put something in the still, look over and double check the valve. And one of the things they taught us at Toyota is Yosh, right? Yoshi is how it's spelled, but it's pronounced Yosh, and basically means check, right? Confirm. And so when I train someone, I say, look, I want you to point at that thing so that I understand that you're doing what you're thinking in your head. Because as you know, a lot of mistakes occur because our brains are sidetracked or on another thought, or in certain situations you basically fall into a hypnosis because of repetition, or what happens at the distillery is what we call getting squirreled, right? You're in the midst of a task and something else requires your attention. You go away from the task, and then you come back and you miss a step, right? And so at the end, after the startup, I say, okay, double check everything all the way around. We do have some more automated kind of error mitigation things, alarms and things to tell us that something needs attention or so on, and we continue to try to incorporate those whenever a mistake is made.
Well, and I mean, yeah, such as life, mistakes are made. Hopefully they're not big, expensive mistakes like shutting down an assembly line for a long time or dumping a barrel of whiskey.
Yeah, I mean, what you deal with in healthcare, I tell people in healthcare, I said, if somebody makes mistakes, your consequences are huge. I mean, that situation at Toyota roughly was about $8.3 million loss, but a loss of a life is worse, and the consequences are more severe. And in those cases, you have to be even more diligent about applying some thinking to minimize the possibility of mistakes, to mitigate. And it is part of life. Unfortunately, it is part of being human. And we know we can look at all kinds of situations where there were redundancies in place, and the outcome still occurred. And I think you hit it on the head. It's ineffective to punish somebody for failing, because we all fail. Mm-hmm. Right now, with that being said, of course, we talk about this a lot, and certainly people in the audience always raise their hand and say, well, sometimes people are responsible. Sometimes they need to be punished. Sometimes blah, blah, blah. I said, look, if I look at a person and they make some significant amount of mistakes more than somebody else, okay, outside some normal range, then maybe that person isn't fit for the work that they're doing, and maybe they need to do something else, right? At Toyota, the idea was, if you make a mistake or something, I'm going to ask you what you think about that and how you can minimize that, and what was going on in your head at the time, and what kind of things can we do to try to minimize that from happening. I had worked with one guy one time, and this was after Toyota when I was consulting as a manager, and he had this fundamental belief that if people had to fix their own mistakes, they wouldn't make that mistake again. And I said, okay, they might not, but what about the next guy? What about the next person who comes into that position?
Yeah.
How's that thinking changing anything? All you're doing is saying, well, you fix your own mistakes, you won't do that again.
I mean, that sounds like the equivalent of putting a dog's nose down and poop on the floor.
Right.
I don't know if that's really effective.
No.
It might feel like it's doing something. You might feel better, but no.
Well, you see, and I'll come full circle, that those are the same kind of things that I had to adapt to and understand and come to terms with my own self. I mean, I certainly had those urges as well, to punish or to, retribution or something. And, it's sort of embedded in us. It's around us. It's in our culture. It's,
Arguably, that blaming is human nature.
Kind of, yeah. I think so.
You can go back to the story of Coco, who passed away, I think, a year or two ago. There was a gorilla that researchers taught American Sign Language. And there's a famous story about Coco where Coco had a real live pet kitten.
Yeah.
Loved it and took care of it. And there was some day when I don't know if the right word is, we'll say researchers, came back in, and there was a sink fixture that had been torn out of the wall. Well, there's only one explanation for what happened, I guess. And they asked Coco what happened, and the story goes that Coco said in sign language, "Cat did it." And so, I mean, that's what I'm saying. We're somehow wired. It must be an evolutionary survival tool. If you can pin blame on someone else and somehow survive, your genes carry forward. So
I think you're right.
But we do the best we can to create cultures where we're focused on fixing the process instead of blaming people. And to me, that's one of the lessons that I'm fortunate to have learned from the former Toyota people I've worked with and been mentored by, and through my own work and experience. But it like a lot of things, it's a hard habit to break.
Yes.
So, well, maybe I'm going to go pour some of your whiskey. That's a habit that I think is one I'm not trying to break. It's a good one. David's products are produced at Glens Creek Distillery, and the website there is glenscreekdistillery.com. For people who are looking to possibly buy and try your whiskeys, can you tell people a little bit about the distribution and what parts of the country they might be able to find you?
Well, first of all, don't blame me that we can't ship.
Okay.
I don't make the laws. I just have to follow the laws, and people misunderstand those all the time. But distribution is, we're small, but we're in 4 states: Kentucky, Tennessee, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And I know it's not enough yet, and we get requests from people all over the place for them. We're doing the best we can. We've grown and we've expanded production, and we had one. I guess we turned one happy mistake into something. We ran out of rye once, one of our secondary grains, and John asked the question, "What would happen if we made 100% corn bourbon?" And usually I say, "I don't know. Let's see. Let's try. Let's do an experiment."
Yeah.
So we have currently a what we call Cobb corn only bourbon that is aging, and hopefully we'll be able to release that shortly, but born out of a kind of a mistake.
Oh, interesting. So when things get back to normal and when I'm in that part of the country, I'm going to come see you again and hopefully get to pick some of that up and try it.
Yep.
And I'm glad that Jim Murray really liked in particular. I think, my favorite of your whiskeys is the Cafe au lait product. Now that was intentional. That was not a mistake, right?
Correct. Yeah, that was intentional.
Yeah. It turned out great. So, our guest, I think this episode's turned out great. So thank you for that, David. Our guest has been David Meier. His books, which I really like a lot as well, the Toyota Way Field Book and the other book, Toyota Talent, co-authored with Jeffrey Liker. And again, it's Glens Creek Distillery. So someone could combine the two, do a pour of whiskey, sit down with a book next to the fire, read and learn, and have a sip and reflect. So, David, thank you for kind of helping us combine those worlds a little bit in the discussion here today.
All right, Mark, always a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks again to David Meier for being our guest today. To learn more about him, about his distillery and his books and more, you can go to markgraban.com/mistake94. As always, I want to thank you for listening. I hope this podcast inspires you to reflect on your own mistakes, how you can learn from them or turn them into a positive. I've had listeners tell me they started being more open and honest about mistakes in their work. And they're trying to create a workplace culture where it's safe to speak up about problems, because that leads to more improvement and better business results. If you have feedback or a story to share, you can email me, myfavoritemistakepodcast@gmail.com. And again, our website is myfavoritemistakepodcast.com.